the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To be honest with this House, I wasn't at first going to rise in debate on C-11 because I spoke at second reading on this bill. But I stayed after question period to hear the debate going on in this place to see how much discussion of veterans hiring and the Veterans Hiring Act there would be. And because so many members of this House chose to sort of quietly say they're going to support the bill, but then used it to talk about a range of other issues, I decided to speak yet again, Mr. Speaker. And it's always an honour for me to speak in the House on issues related to the Canadian Forces and our veterans, and particularly to try and raise the level of debate, to try and bring some actual statistics and facts to bear on it, and as well as to highlight some of the amazing work being done by non-governmental actors in both the rehabilitation and particularly the retraining and employment of our veterans. I did that at second reading, highlighting some exceptional Canadian leaders in that regard. I'll do a little bit more of that today, Mr. Speaker. But going back to C-11, as I said in my previous speech in this House, Mr. Speaker, this has both an important impact on a small number of veterans, but perhaps more importantly, it has massive symbolism as the Canadian government is one of the, if not the largest employer in the country. So C-11 states that after 3 years of honourable service in the Canadian Forces, someone that transitions out of the forces and becomes a veteran has priority 1 hiring in the rest of the civil service. And they have that for a 5-year period, Mr. Speaker. We've heard some members of this House state that, they still have to qualify for the position. Of course they do, Mr. Speaker. Veterans leave the Canadian Forces when they hang up their uniform, have an amazing range of skills and experience, Mr. Speaker. In fact, last night after I appeared on a panel and tried desperately for the second time to explain how the estimates process in this House works to my friend from Guelph, a retired Canadian Forces captain from Chester, Nova Scotia, emailed me to say he shared my frustration with the lack of uptake with my friends. And he told his story to me in an email of how he served for several years in the Canadian Forces and then transitioned to I think a 20-plus year as a Foreign Service officer for Canada. So certainly it's been the experience from the Great War right through to today that we've seen a lot of citizen soldiers and soldiers who become corporate leaders and productive business owners and entrepreneurs. And it is up to the veteran to qualify for the position, Mr. Speaker, but they will get priority 1 hiring, meaning if there's several eligible candidates, that veteran with service-related injuries will get the priority hiring. And it's important to see who could be impacted by this, Mr. Speaker, because it's not a couple of people, as some of the colleagues, my colleagues in this debate have suggested. There are about 4,000 men and women who release from the Canadian Forces each year. Majority of those are regular sort of retirements or completions of service contracts. When I left after 12 years, Mr. Speaker, I would have been in the several thousand that year to transition out. But there's over 1,200 of all ranks, Mr. Speaker, that leave because of medical release. That could be everything from someone who's had an injury right through to somebody whose medical category might have changed, like vision declining for a pilot before they got their wings, that sort of thing. 1,200's a big number, Mr. Speaker, and the vast majority of those would have post-secondary education because now both non-commissioned members of the Canadian Forces and officers tend to have at least a college or a bachelor's degree, Mr. Speaker. If you're looking at some of the specialized trades within the Canadian Forces, they have some of the most cutting-edge training from a technology, from an intelligence gathering, communications and signals, in-demand services, Mr. Speaker, also used by other departments within the government. Many of them would also be bilingual, Mr. Speaker, either joining the Canadian Forces with a bilingual background or receiving training over the course of their time in uniform. therefore even making them even a stronger candidate for some of the work with the federal government. And this bill puts a 5-year time frame on it because that's an appropriate time frame for the priority hiring. That 5-year period will allow that veteran to access retraining or vocational support as part of their retirement or departure from the Canadian Forces. They'll be able to educate, potentially move back to their place of enrollment or place in Canada, and that period gives them that chance. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that our government has actually dramatically increased what a veteran can get in terms of retraining and education assistance. There's higher numbers of education assistance while they're in uniform in the Canadian Forces, and there's more outside. In fact, the total envelope that an individual veteran could get, depending on their background, the time in, what courses they take, is in the tens of thousands of dollars, Mr. Speaker, of that retraining and re-education assistance. And that will be accomplished within those first 5 years, and that will be the period of time that priority hiring will be held for that veteran. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other items people have addressed in the debate today to show that overall our government is making tremendous strides, particularly on the transition of men and women from uniform in the Canadian Forces to their life and the transition to life, civilian life as a veteran. In fact, the Auditor General's report from today, Mr. Speaker, one of the things it highlights that our government has invested heavily with Veterans Affairs and is meeting its objectives, is the rehabilitation and vocational assistance. Now, one of my friends in this House suggested that was a small thing I was focusing on in the AG's audit on veterans' mental health. No, actually, that was one of the two major categories the auditor looked at 4,600 veterans with a mental health condition of some sort, and the department's goal was to make sure that veterans could qualify for this rehabilitation and vocational assistance. Their goal was 80% to qualify and be on the program within 2 weeks within the department. The Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, showed that 84% are getting onto that program within the 2-week goal, Mr. Speaker. So in the case of rehabilitation and vocational assistance, which is directly germane to this debate because it's about transitioning and allowing veterans to get the education or training to become a priority hire of the federal government or a great hire for the private sector, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General saying we're getting that pretty much right. As a veteran, I'd love to see 100% within 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker. And we should always be striving to do a little bit better. But in this House, we should also strive to actually look at a report that comes out like this. It's important, Mr. Speaker, because we asked the Auditor General to look at mental health. We wanted to see where we were doing well and where we had to improve, because we are investing heavily, Mr. Speaker. The Auditor General suggested $500 million each year earmarked specifically for mental health support. On the weekend, there was a new announcement about even more money, Mr. Speaker. But it's also about performance and whether that money is making the intended impact. That is why our government asked the Auditor General to look at this area. That's important context. Another thing about the Auditor General's report that I take as a good indication, Mr. Speaker, is some of the statistics. The big one is, I think, showing that we are finally addressing the issue of stigma, which haunts mental health, not just in the Veterans community, but the mental health discussion across the country. Stigma affects the ability for somebody to come forward and ask for help. I've spoken in this House before about the MP for my riding 100 years ago, Sam Sharp, who served at Vimy as a sitting MP and took his own life on return from World War I at the Royal Victoria Hospital, Mr. Speaker, from shell shock. We've actually not been dealing well throughout our history with post-traumatic stress, with mental illness as a result of service. We're getting better. We still have a ways to go, but we're getting better. What did the Auditor General say? 10 years ago, there was only about 2% that would identify as a medically released veteran with a mental health injury. Now that's 12%, so there's been a 10% increase. Has there been, some of that would be attributable to the fact that we were engaged in a combat mission in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, certainly. But I think all members, and certainly any advocates in the mental health community, would also say that the reason we're seeing that higher number over such a short period of time is we're finally getting to the stigma issue. And there's more Canadians being willing to come forward to seek treatment, some of which is innovative and can really help them get back to leading a fully productive life as not just a soldier, but as a father or a mother, Mr. Speaker. Getting rid of that stigma allows them to get the support quicker. You know, I saw on the news the other day a veteran concerned that he went undiagnosed from his tour in Bosnia years ago, Mr. Speaker. That's likely because the Canadian Forces and really society 20 years ago wasn't doing well in this area. The first operational stress injury clinic, Mr. Speaker, for the Canadian Forces was not opened until 2002. And there was two, perhaps a third, almost open under the previous government, Mr. Speaker. We've opened an additional 12 to 14 in that time, Mr. Speaker, and announced on the weekend that a new one will open in Halifax and satellite offices in another 7 communities, bringing the total up to 25 to spread that operational stress injury clinic network across the country. So when men and women leave the Canadian Forces, they have support regardless of where they live. So the Auditor General has shown that I think more Canadians are coming forward to get the help they need. That training and educational assistance, which I said numbers in tens of thousands of dollars, can help them retrain and be ready for an opportunity in the federal public service as a Priority 1 hire under the Veterans Hiring Act, C-11, or within the private sector, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to showcase some of the leadership going on across the country when it comes to hiring our veterans. Groups, nonprofit charitable groups like Canada Company, Mr. Speaker, which has a hiring program with employers, engaging them, reaching out to veterans and trying to plug them into opportunities. Someone I served in the military with, Walter Moniz, Mr. Speaker, works very diligently on that program for Canada Company, and I'd like to thank Blake Goldring for starting Canada Company and this program on hiring and transition for our veterans. True Patriot Love, Mr. Speaker, a charity that I've been involved with prior to my time in Parliament and was involved in forming, hosted a conference called From Battlefield to Boardroom, Mr. Speaker, focused at HR leaders within companies, human resources leaders, so that they could learn about the value of hiring a veteran, so they could actually learn what the difference between a corporal and a colonel is, which is self-evident when you're in uniform, but it's not as evident to civilian employers or an HR department if they have no familiarity with military service and the experience that those Canadians would have. So that Battlefields to Boardroom conference, at that conference, there were veterans that secured jobs when employers realized what a tremendous opportunity they were for their company. Finally, I've also spoken in this House on a few occasions about a really exceptional group, Mr. Speaker, called Treble Victor. And that's a group of former military members, not just from the Canadian Forces, but also from our allied forces. There are some British and French veterans. There's a South African veteran that are volunteers. They serve some time in uniform and now want to help men and women leaving transition into meaningful post-CF employment. These are people that have busy careers and lives but volunteer their time to meet with employers and to mentor the men and women of the Canadian Forces transitioning. I've had the good fortune of working with Treble Victor for many years and want to applaud them on their efforts. Again, Mr. Speaker, Tim Patrickin is the current head of Treble Victor, and I want to thank them for their work. So with so many groups and employers already doing this. I should also add one of the carpenters' unions, Mr. Speaker, has also done a tremendous job in terms of reaching out directly, and their members. I've met some of their leadership reaching out and giving opportunities within the skilled trades, Mr. Speaker. So with all of these groups, non-governmental operators, charities, people volunteering their time, isn't it important that the government shows that we're also putting the hiring of veterans as a priority? I said, I think at second reading, Mr. Speaker, whether this bill, C-11, hires 10 people or 100 people, I think the symbolism of this bill is as important as the men and women who may benefit from it, because it shows the federal government as one of the largest employers in the country with coast-to-coast reach puts a priority on hiring our veterans, particularly those that exit as a result of a medical injury or a medical category change of some sort, Mr. Speaker. So the federal government has the obligation to show leadership on this front, and C-11 is the embodiment of this. I would like to return to a subject that, I've spoken about several times, Mr. Speaker, in this House, that sadly has become so politicized that we can't even have an honest debate about it, and that's the 9 regional Veterans Affairs bricks and mortar offices that were closed, Mr. Speaker. I asked the members from Guelph and Random Buren St. George if veterans in their ridings used a bricks and mortar office, Mr. Speaker. I'd invite Canadians, invite yourself, Mr. Speaker, to check Hansard. You'll see they didn't answer that question. In fact, while I was on a political panel with the defense critic from the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, and I suggested the Legion plays an important role on helping veterans access their benefits and services, I was mocked for that position, Mr. Speaker. Mocked. She said, I think she said something like, you're outsourcing to the Legion. Mr. Speaker, the Legion, created in 1925 and a 1926 Act of Parliament in this House, was empowered from its start to help support our veterans. There's actually no better network of people helping our veterans than Legion veteran service officers. They've done it for generations, Mr. Speaker. That was the real answer to the question that my friend from Random Buren St. George didn't want to answer. In small communities like Stephenville and Marystown, in her riding, there was never a bricks and mortar office, Mr. Speaker. Were the veterans for 50 years not helped or ignored? No, Mr. Speaker. In a vast majority of cases, they were helped by their veteran service officers who have a direct link into Veterans Affairs Canada. In fact, the Auditor General's report today, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General himself asked some of the veteran service officers their thoughts on some of the cumbersome administrative forms used in their help with veterans. So the Auditor General asked the Legion about how we could maybe make some of these administrative forms and the delays from them shorter. In fact, our government already moved on that, Mr. Speaker, to make the application form, I think, down from 7 pages down to 3 or something like that. And the Auditor General went back to veteran service officers from the Legion to once again ask, have these changes been beneficial? It's there in his report, Mr. Speaker. So this is the issue that we don't talk about in a rational way. Our government has the obligation to provide support and access to that support for veterans who are in their late 20s from Afghanistan to veterans in their 90s, like some of whom are in Italy right now visiting Ortona and the places they helped liberate, Mr. Speaker. We have to do that not by staying put the way things were done in the 1950s. As a veteran, I think it is important for us to do what we're doing, opening 18 to 25 operational stress injury clinics across the country which actually deliver services, not doing things in a way that only 8 or 9 people were walking in an office to fill in forms. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, that the Veterans Hiring Act is not just an opportunity to revisit why it's so important for the federal government to lead in this category and this issue. I hope it's a good opportunity for all members of this House to try and bring a much more informed and dedicated debate to this House when it comes to veterans. Thank you.
Question commentaire, l'honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire pour son discours, mais étant donné qu'il a évoqué la question de l'honnêteté, on va lui demander de faire preuve d'honnêteté, justement, dans le cadre du débat qu'on tient en ce moment. Vous savez, Monsieur le Président, malheureusement, suite aux événements du 22 octobre, les conservateurs ont refusé de changer l'horaire du comité des anciens combattants. Alors, ce qui a empêché, entre autres, de recevoir comme témoins les personnes directement concernées, c'est-à-dire des groupes d'anciens combattants ainsi que des représentants du syndicat de la fonction publique. Alors, j'aimerais savoir de la part du secrétaire parlementaire pourquoi est-ce que les conservateurs ont été intraitables et il ne faut pas se le cacher, ont refusé de mener le débat de façon vraiment ouverte dans une question aussi importante.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. Certainly, when I was on the Veterans Affairs Standing Committee, we heard regularly from witnesses. The one thing I can say, there was extensive consultation done in the review the committee did on the new Veterans Charter, which I applaud their unanimous decisions on. Many of the groups involved in transition, involved in the issues related to C11, actually appeared before that, Mr. Speaker. Many of the NATO veterans, the Legion Veterans Transition Program, they appeared and that input was taken. I'm glad he mentioned the public sector and PSAC union, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the only negative comments about C11 that I've been able to find have been from the public sector union, Mr. Speaker. And what's unfortunate about that is they have also been the one that really crafted this debate on the regional offices. Because at their first press conference in October of last year, Mr. Speaker, I attended that meeting. And Mr. Clark from Sydney said, I just want to make sure that someone in my office, the Service Canada office, has experience with veterans. We listened, Mr. Speaker, and by Christmas we transferred a veterans case officer from the office that was closing to the Service Canada office down the street, listening directly to his input, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, that's been lost in the discussion of this because it's being pushed forward by the invisible hand, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sydney Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and you know, I got to sympathize with the member for trying to defend the government on the disaster on the Veterans Affairs file, but I just had to get up because when he started talking about Sydney and Cape Breton and how Mr. Clark was speaking, and I mean, put it in context and how the legions are going to help service them and how they can go to a building and you don't need a building. Well, I tell you, he should have been at the rally where there was over 2,000 or 3,000 people in support of the veterans and what they're going through and the service they're not getting and how the pressure is being put on the legions. So I like for him to try to explain how all these legions, we have about 30 in Cape Breton, there's probably one or maybe looking to step up and do it, which they cannot do. And these caseworkers are so used to working with these members from the Legion and these veterans, and now they have to travel to Halifax. They have to travel over 300 miles to get to any service. So how can he defend that position of closing that office in Sydney that services so many veterans, where Cape Breton is one of the biggest contributors to any war movement in the last 100 years?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for raising that issue. In fact, I've enjoyed my discussions with Mr. Clark on this very issue. In fact, after we listened to his input and the minister made the change, I called Mr. Clark at home to tell him that we would be transferring a caseworker, maybe even the one he was used to dealing with, into the Service Canada office, Mr. Speaker. Those standalone VAC offices did not deliver care to our veterans. I've heard some members refer to them as hospitals, and they provided administrative support. Now, if you go into the Service Canada, and I invite that member to do this, there's a separate kiosk in Sydney manned by an experienced Veterans Affairs caseworker. In that Sydney office, there was only about 8 to 10 people in per day, so one person to help with the administration is sufficient. He's highlighted the Legions, Mr. Speaker, and I would bet that for decades, most veterans on Cape Breton Island and in Sydney, Greater Sydney, have been using their veteran service officers at the Legion. If there's issues that they're having, we should work on those. The Auditor General's referring to their work, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like the member to get out and meet with those Legions, and let's see how we can make sure they continue to do the leadership job they have been doing.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, and I know the Parliamentary Secretary has been referring to this as Bill C-11, but it's actually C-27. But I'd like to ask him, when he was Parliamentary Secretary and they closed the Windsor office, how many clients now have to go to London for their service? How many clients, in specific from Windsor, lost service?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a great visit to Windsor, where I met with a number of veterans on this specific issue, including a veteran I know he knows well, Bruce Moncourt, who I consider a friend, who's an advocate on these issues. But here's a direct answer to his question, Mr. Speaker. There were fewer than 150 case-managed veterans in that wider area. There's only 7,500 veterans across Canada that have a case manager, and a case manager is assigned based on complexity of the case on a variety of subjects, including mental health or medical issues. So within the catchment basin, there would be fewer than 150. That's why, Mr. Speaker, on most days you'd have less than 10 people in that physical office. Because if there's only 150 people that might be using it on a regular basis, Mr. Speaker, how many of those are going to go on the same day? So in Windsor, as the member knows, we've taken one of the experienced caseworkers from that office, and they're now in the Service Canada office. I can't remember if the Service Canada office is in the same building in Windsor or if it's nearby. I think it's nearby. That can handle any of the folks that come in. They have the experience, and they can give that same level of administrative support, Mr. Speaker. Change is hard, but a lot of the younger veterans tended not to go into the bricks and mortar offices anyways, Mr. Speaker. So we've been doing the MyVac online account where a number of Afghanistan veterans have registered to manage their case online. It's not about doing it just the way it was done in the 50s, Mr. Speaker. It's about serving veterans from 20 to 90.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in regards to the bill itself, we recognize that some of the best examples, the Manitoba commissioners, individuals that go out and hire individuals that have retired from the forces. There's a great asset that is there that members of our forces bring to the table. Having said that, and that's really what this bill is about in terms of the government, it's interesting. The government is laying off tens of thousands of civil servants, and they're promoting this particular bill. But let's push that to the side because this member wants to focus on its massive cuts. And that's really what it is, Mr. Speaker. He stands up, he can put all the color he wants to it. The bottom line is the government cut services to vets through offices all across the country at the same time in which they had hundreds of millions of dollars that were lapsed, that weren't spent. So my question to the member is actually very specific. He cannot tell this House that people were not using that office because that would be wrong. People were using the office. Why does he believe the Prime Minister chose to make those cuts to services to the vets at the same time in which they were not spending hundreds of millions of dollars?
Exactly.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, there's so much in there, I'm not sure where to start. But I would like to show him that there have been veterans in the last few years being hired. I had the honour of speaking on a panel on military family support with Dominic Kolasar, who was wounded in his service in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, and now works in the federal government, is a tremendous leader. So there are real opportunities right now. And what we're doing with C-27, thanks to my opposition friend for correcting me, I spoke on C-11, is we're making sure it's a top priority so we get more Dominics. My friend and I appreciate his work. We've hosted events for veterans on the Hill together. He served in the forces, and I appreciate it. He knows very well that when it comes to lapses, a lapse only exists, Mr. Speaker, because we didn't hit our estimate. So if a Canadian household estimates they're going to spend with Manitoba Hydro $2,000 in their year but come under that, do they ask Manitoba Hydro for the $2,000 back? No, they had not paid it, Mr. Speaker. It was an estimate. The member knows that. There was a $100 million lapse in the last year of the Martin government. That's mainly due to the fact that not enough veterans are accessing the services, and some of our World War II and Korean veterans, Mr. Speaker, are passing away.